The dusty stagecoach rolled into Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory on a blazing hot afternoon in August 1882. The wheels kicked up clouds of red dirt that settled on everything like a fine powder. From the coach stepped a woman who looked completely out of place in this rough frontier town. Her name was Catherine Wells, and she wore a proper traveling dress that had seen better days but still showed quality. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly under a small hat, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had received a good education. The townspeople stopped what they were doing to stare. Women were scarce in Cedar Ridge, especially ones who looked like they could read and write. Most of the folks here were miners, ranchers, and traders who had come west looking for gold or land. They weren't used to seeing a lady who looked like she belonged in a fancy parlor back east. Catherine had traveled for 3 weeks to get here, and every mile had taken her further from the life she once knew. Back in Boston, she had been a respected teacher at a private school for young ladies. She had a comfortable apartment, friends who invited her to tea parties, and a future that seemed secure. But all of that changed when she discovered that the school's headmaster had been stealing money from the families who paid tuition. When Catherine reported what she found, nobody believed her. Instead, they accused her of making up stories to cover her own mistakes. The scandal destroyed her reputation overnight. Parents pulled their daughters from her classes. Her friends stopped inviting her to social gatherings. The school dismissed her without pay, and other schools refused to hire her. Word spread quickly through Boston's tight social circles that Catherine Wells was trouble. Soon she couldn't even find work as a governess. With her savings running low and no prospects in sight, Catherine saw an advertisement in the newspaper. The territory of Arizona needed teachers for its growing settlements. The pay wasn't much, but it included a place to live and a chance to start fresh where nobody knew her story. She spent her last money on a train ticket west and then a stagecoach ride to Cedar Ridge. Now, standing in the middle of this dusty street with her 2 small suitcases, Catherine wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The town was smaller than she had imagined. There was one main street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and not much else. The buildings were made of rough wood and adobe, and everything looked temporary, like people might pack up and leave at any moment. A man in a worn cowboy hat approached her. He introduced himself as Tom Bradley, the mayor of Cedar Ridge. He was also the owner of the general store, and one of the few people in town who could read well enough to handle correspondence with the territorial government. He had been the one to write the letter requesting a teacher. "Miss Wells, I presume?" he said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Catherine smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley. I'm grateful for the opportunity to teach here." Bradley looked her up and down, taking in her proper dress and educated manner of speaking. She could see the doubt in his eyes. "Well, I'll be honest with you, miss. The children here aren't like the ones you might be used to back east. They're rough around the edges. Most of them have never been inside a real schoolhouse before." "I understand," Catherine replied. "I'm prepared for the challenges." What she wasn't prepared for was the loneliness. Bradley showed her to the small building that served as both schoolhouse and her living quarters. It was just 2 rooms, one for teaching and one for her to live in. There was a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. The walls were thin, and she could hear every sound from the street outside. That first night, Catherine sat at her table by candlelight and wrote in her diary. She wondered if she would ever fit in here. The people seemed suspicious of outsiders, especially educated women. She had heard whispers as she walked through town, comments about her fancy clothes and city ways, but Catherine wasn't the only outsider in Cedar Ridge. About 3 miles from town, on a small ranch in a valley between 2 hills, lived a man who was even more isolated than she was. His name was Daniel Crowfeather, though most people just called him Dan. His mother had been Apache. His father, a Mexican vaquero, who had loved her enough to stay with her tribe for several years before both were killed in a cavalry raid. Dan had been 12 years old when the soldiers came. He tried to run, but a bullet shattered his left leg below the knee. The Apache medicine man did what he could, but infection set in. To save Dan's life, they had to cut off the damaged portion of his leg. An old Apache craftsman carved him a wooden leg from oak, and Dan learned to walk again, though he would always have a noticeable limp. After the raid, Dan's uncle took him to live with relatives in Mexico for a few years. There, he learned to read and write in Spanish. A kindly priest taught him English and even some Latin. Dan discovered he had a gift for languages. He could speak Apache, Spanish, English, and pick up enough of other tribal dialects to get by. He also learned about ranching from his Mexican cousins, who taught him how to handle cattle and horses. When Dan turned 18, he used a small inheritance from his father to buy land near Cedar Ridge. It wasn't much, just a few hundred acres of rough country that nobody else wanted. But Dan knew the land in ways that the white settlers didn't. He knew where to find water during dry spells, which plants could be used for medicine, and how to read the signs that told him when storms were coming. Dan's ranch was modest but well run. He raised a small herd of cattle and sold them to mining camps and army posts. He also traded with Apache bands who still moved through the area, exchanging manufactured goods for furs and handmade items. This made some of the townspeople nervous. They didn't trust anyone who had dealings with the Apache, especially someone who was part Apache himself. The truth was, most people in Cedar Ridge were afraid of Dan. They saw his wooden leg and his dark skin, heard rumors about his Apache connections, and decided he was dangerous. Some called him names behind his back. Others crossed the street to avoid walking near him when he came to town for supplies. Children were told to stay away from the crippled Indian. Dan had learned to ignore the stares and whispers. He conducted his business quietly and efficiently, then returned to his ranch where he could live in peace. He had his books, his animals, and the vast sky overhead. It wasn't the life he had dreamed of as a child, but it was better than being dependent on anyone else's charity or pity. Neither Catherine nor Dan knew it yet, but their lives were about to intersect in ways that would change both of them forever. The frontier was a place where people had to rely on each other to survive, even if they came from completely different worlds. And sometimes, the most unlikely partnerships could grow into something strong enough to withstand any storm. Catherine had been teaching in Cedar Ridge for 2 months when the storm hit. September rains in Arizona. Territory could be unpredictable and dangerous. What started as a light drizzle in the morning had turned into a torrential downpour by afternoon. The schoolhouse, which had seemed sturdy enough during dry weather, began to leak in several places. Water dripped through the roof and pooled on the wooden floor where her students sat trying to practice their letters. There were 12 children in her class, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Most came from families who lived on small ranches or worked in the nearby copper mine. They were good kids, but they had been right to warn her. They were different from the well-behaved young ladies she had taught back in Boston. These children were used to hard work and speaking their minds. They didn't sit quietly with their hands folded like proper students were supposed to do, but Catherine had grown to love them anyway. There was Lucy, the 10-year-old daughter of a miner who was so eager to learn that she stayed after school to practice reading. There was Tommy, a 13-year-old ranch boy who struggled with letters but could solve math problems in his head faster than Catherine could write them on the slate board. And there was little Maria, whose family had come from Mexico and who was learning English with a determination that amazed everyone. As the rain pounded harder on the roof, Catherine began to worry. The creek that ran behind the schoolhouse was usually just a trickle, but she could hear it getting louder and faster. In the distance, thunder rolled across the desert and lightning lit up the dark clouds. "Miss Wells," said Tommy, looking up from his slate, "my pa says when it rains like this, the creek can flood real quick. Maybe we should head home early today." Catherine looked out the window and saw water running down the main street like a river. Several of the children lived on the other side of the creek, and if it flooded, they would be trapped at the school overnight. She made a quick decision. "You're right, Tommy. Everyone pack up your things. We're going to get you home safely before this gets any worse." The children moved quickly, gathering their books and lunch pails. But when Catherine opened the schoolhouse door, she gasped. The creek had already overflowed its banks. Water was rushing past the building, carrying branches and debris. The wooden bridge that crossed the creek was completely underwater. "We can't cross that," said Lucy, her voice trembling. "It's too deep and moving too fast." Catherine's heart raced. She had to get these children to safety, but she didn't know enough about flash floods to know what to do. The water seemed to be rising by the minute. What if the schoolhouse flooded? What if they were all swept away? Just then she heard the sound of horse hooves and wagon wheels splashing through the water. A man was driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses, heading straight for the schoolhouse. Catherine had never seen him before, But even from a distance, she could tell something was different about the way he sat in the wagon seat. His left leg was positioned at an odd angle, and he held the reins with a confidence that suggested he was used to handling difficult situations. The man brought his wagon right up to the schoolhouse door. He was younger than Catherine had expected, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and skin weathered by sun and wind. When he spoke, his voice was calm and reassuring. "Miss Wells, I'm Dan Crowfeather. I live up in the valley. Saw the storm coming and figured you might need help getting the children across the creek." Catherine stared at him for a moment. She had heard the name whispered around town, always followed by warnings to stay away from that Apache. But looking at him now, she saw nothing threatening. His dark eyes were kind, and he spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had been well educated. "The bridge is flooded," Catherine said. "I don't know how to get them across safely." Dan climbed down from his wagon, and Catherine noticed the wooden leg for the first time. He walked with a slight limp, but he moved with purpose and confidence. He waded into the rushing water to test its depth and current. "It's not as bad as it looks," he called back. "The horses can handle it, and the wagon is heavy enough not to get pushed around. But we need to move fast. The rain is still coming down hard upstream." Catherine hesitated for just a moment. Everything she had been told about this man suggested she should be afraid of him. But looking at his face, she saw only genuine concern for the children's safety. And they needed help desperately. "Children," she said, "Mr. Crowfeather is going to help us get across the creek. Everyone climb into the wagon carefully." The children didn't hesitate. They had more sense than the adults in town when it came to judging character. They climbed into the wagon bed, chattering excitedly about their adventure. Dan made sure everyone was seated safely, then helped Catherine up onto the wagon seat beside him. "Hold on tight," he said. "The horses know what they're doing, but it might be a bumpy ride." Dan guided the horses into the rushing water with steady hands. The wagon swayed and rocked as the current pushed against it, but the horses never faltered. Dan spoke to them in a language Catherine didn't recognize. Probably Apache, she thought. Whatever he was saying, it seemed to calm the animals and give them confidence. Halfway across, a large branch came floating downstream, heading straight for them. Dan saw it coming and skillfully maneuvered the wagon to avoid a collision. The children cheered as if it were all a grand game, but Catherine could see the concentration on Dan's face as he navigated the dangerous crossing. When they reached the other side safely, Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. Dan drove the wagon to each child's home, making sure they were all safely delivered to their families. Despite the storm, he took his time with each stop, checking to make sure every child was warm and dry before moving on to the next house. The last stop was the schoolhouse, where Catherine lived. By now, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but it was getting dark. Dan helped Catherine down from the wagon, and she realized she had no idea how to thank him properly. "Mr. Crowfeather," she said, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Those children could have been seriously hurt." Dan shrugged, as if risking his own safety to help strangers was nothing unusual. "The desert can be dangerous if you don't know how to read the signs. I saw the storm building and knew the creek would flood. It seemed like the right thing to do." Catherine looked at this man who had just saved her and 12 children from a potentially deadly situation. He was well-spoken and clearly intelligent. His actions had been brave and selfless, yet the people in town had described him as someone to fear and avoid. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively. "It's the least I can do after what you've done for us." Dan looked surprised by the invitation. "That's kind of you, Miss Wells, but people might talk if they see my wagon outside your place." "Let them talk," Catherine said firmly. "You just saved the lives of their children. If they have a problem with me thanking you properly, that says more about them than it does about us." Dan smiled for the first time since she had met him, and Catherine was struck by how it transformed his entire face. He looked younger and less guarded, more like the kind man she had glimpsed during their dangerous journey across the flooded creek. "Well," he said, "I suppose I could use some coffee after a day like this." As they walked into the schoolhouse together, neither of them realized that this simple act of kindness and gratitude would be the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the most important moments start with the smallest gestures. A cup of coffee shared between two people who have nothing in common except the recognition that doing the right thing matters more than what other people might say. That cup of coffee turned into an evening that Catherine would never forget. As she and Dan sat at her small table, steam rising from their cups, she discovered that everything the townspeople had told her about him was wrong. He wasn't dangerous or wild. Instead, he was one of the most intelligent and thoughtful men she had ever met. Dan told her about his childhood with the Apache, how his grandmother had taught him to read the natural world like a book. He could predict weather patterns by watching cloud formations and animal behavior. He knew which plants could heal wounds and which ones could poison. But he had also learned to love books and learning from the Mexican priest who had taken him in after the raid. "I have a small library at my ranch," Dan said, his eyes lighting up. "Nothing fancy, but I've collected books over the years. Philosophy, history, poetry. Reading helps pass the long winter evenings." Catherine was amazed. In Boston, she had known many educated men, but most of them had learned their knowledge from classrooms and textbooks. Dan had learned from both books and life, creating a wisdom that seemed deeper and more practical than anything she had encountered before. "What's your favorite book?" she asked. Dan thought for a moment. "I suppose it would be Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. There's something about the way he writes about America. All of it, not just the parts that are easy to love. He sees beauty in places where other people only see problems." Catherine nodded enthusiastically. "I love Whitman too, the way he finds hope even in difficult circumstances. His poems remind me that there's always something worth fighting for." They talked until late into the night about books, about teaching, about the challenges of living on the frontier. Catherine found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her dreams of making a real difference in children's lives. Her fears about whether she was strong enough for frontier life. Even some of the pain from her experience back in Boston. Dan listened without judgment, offering insights that showed he understood what it felt like to be an outsider. When Catherine finally walked him to the door, she felt like she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A true friend. "Thank you," she said, "for saving us today, but also for this. I haven't had a real conversation like this since I left Boston." "Neither have I," Dan replied. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime. I could bring you some books from my collection if you'd like." Catherine smiled. "I'd like that very much." Over the following weeks, Dan began visiting Catherine regularly. He would come by the schoolhouse in the evenings after the children had gone home, always bringing books to share or wild herbs from the desert that he thought she might find interesting. Catherine looked forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Dan was unlike anyone she had ever known. Gentle but strong, educated but practical, someone who had faced terrible hardships but had not let them make him bitter. Dan found himself equally drawn to Catherine. She had a quick mind and genuine curiosity about everything around her. When he showed her desert plants, she wanted to know not just their names but how they survived in such harsh conditions. When he told her Apache stories, she listened with respect and asked thoughtful questions about the culture and beliefs behind them. But it wasn't just intellectual attraction. Catherine had a kindness that showed in everything she did. She never looked at his wooden leg with pity or disgust the way most people did. She never made him feel like he was less than whole. And when she laughed at something he said, her whole face lit up in a way that made his heart beat faster. The people of Cedar Ridge began to notice Dan's regular visits to the schoolhouse. At first it was just curious glances and whispered comments, but as the weeks turned into months, the whispers grew louder and more critical. "That teacher woman is spending an awful lot of time with that half-breed," Mrs. Patterson said to her neighbor while hanging laundry. "It ain't proper for a single lady to be entertaining men like that." "Especially not his kind," replied Mrs. Henderson. "Mark my words, no good will come of it. Those people can't be trusted." The criticism reached Catherine's ears quickly in a town as small as Cedar Ridge. Mayor Bradley visited her at the schoolhouse one evening, his face serious and uncomfortable. "Miss Wells," he said, "I need to speak with you about something delicate. There's been talk about your friendship with Dan Crow Feather." Catherine felt her back stiffen. "What kind of talk?" "People are concerned about your reputation. This is a small community with traditional values. A single woman spending time alone with a man, especially, well, someone like him, it doesn't look proper." "Someone like him?" Catherine's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean someone who saved 12 children from drowning? Someone who is more educated and better read than half the men in this town?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Miss Wells, I'm not saying he's a bad person, but he's different. He's got Apache blood, and folks around here have reason to be wary of Indians. There have been raids, people killed, and his disability, well, it makes some people uncomfortable. Catherine stood up, her hands trembling with anger. Mr. Bradley, Dan Crowfeather is one of the finest men I have ever met. If the people of this town are too ignorant to see that, it says nothing about him and everything about them. Miss Wells, please be reasonable. Your job here depends on the support of the community. If parents start pulling their children out of school because they don't approve of your associations. The threat was clear, but Catherine was beyond caring about consequences. Are you telling me that I must choose between my job and my friends? I'm telling you to think carefully about your future here, Bradley said. That's all. After he left, Catherine sat alone in her small room, staring at the books Dan had lent her. She thought about the choice she was being forced to make. She could end her friendship with Dan, conform to the town's expectations, and keep her position as teacher. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice. But then she thought about Dan himself, his kindness, his intelligence, the way he made her feel like the best version of herself. She thought about the conversations they shared, the way he respected her mind and her independence. She thought about how his face lit up when he saw her, and how her heart raced when she heard his wagon coming down the road. The truth was, Catherine had fallen in love with Dan Crowfeather. She hadn't planned it or expected it, but it had happened anyway. And now she was being asked to give up that love to satisfy the prejudices of people who didn't even know him. Meanwhile, Dan was facing his own pressures. Word of his visits to the schoolhouse had spread beyond Cedar Ridge, to the surrounding ranches and mining camps. Some men had approached him directly, warning him to stay away from the white woman teacher. You're playing with fire, Breed, one rancher had told him. That woman ain't for the likes of you. Best remember your place before somebody reminds you of it. Dan had faced threats before, but this time was different. This time, someone he cared about could be hurt because of his actions. He began to wonder if he should stop visiting Catherine, for her sake, if not his own. But when he saw her face light up as he approached the schoolhouse that evening, when she ran to greet him with obvious joy, he knew he couldn't give up what they had found together. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he was willing to face them for the chance to be with the woman he loved. Catherine, he said that night as they sat reading together by lamplight. There's something I need to tell you. She looked up from her book, seeing the serious expression on his face. What is it? I love you, Dan said simply. I know it's complicated. I know it causes problems for you, but I needed you to know. Catherine set down her book and reached for his hands. I love you too, she said, and I don't care what anyone else thinks about it. But even as they held each other, both knew that love alone might not be enough to overcome the obstacles they faced. The frontier could be an unforgiving place for those who dared to be different, and they were about to discover just how high the price of their happiness might be. The winter of 1883 was harsh in more ways than one. As snow fell on the mountains surrounding Cedar Ridge, the coldness between Catherine and the townspeople grew even more bitter. Her declaration of love for Dan had somehow become public knowledge, and the reaction was swift and merciless. Parents began pulling their children out of school. First it was just 2 families, then 5, then 8. By February, Catherine had only 4. Students left, children whose parents either didn't care about the gossip or were too desperate for their children's education to let prejudice interfere. Catherine watched her classroom, empty with a heavy heart, but she refused to give up on the children who remained. She poured even more energy into teaching them, determined to give them the best education she could provide. Little Maria was now reading at a level that would have impressed teachers back in Boston. Lucy had discovered a talent for mathematics that amazed everyone. The few remaining students were thriving under Catherine's dedicated attention, but the isolation was taking its toll. Women crossed the street to avoid her when she walked to the general store. The preacher delivered sermons about the dangers of unholy unions that were clearly directed at her. Even some of the men who had once been polite now treated her with open hostility. Dan faced even worse treatment. Someone had poisoned 2 of his cattle, and his fence lines were repeatedly cut, allowing his remaining animals to wander onto other people's property. Rocks were thrown at his windows and threatening messages were left on his door. The general store began refusing to sell him supplies, forcing him to travel to other towns for basic necessities. One cold February evening, as Dan sat in Catherine's small living quarters sharing a simple dinner, he brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. "Catherine," he said quietly, "maybe we should think about leaving Cedar Ridge." Catherine looked up from her plate. "Leave, but this is my job, my home. Where would we go?" "I know it's asking a lot," Dan said, "but I've been thinking about what my Apache grandfather told me before he died. He said sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from a fight you can't win, so you can live to fight another day." Catherine considered this. The truth was, she had been thinking the same thing. The hostility was getting worse, not better. She was accomplishing very little as a teacher with so few students, and the stress was wearing her down, but leaving would mean giving up everything she had worked for. "If we left," she said slowly, "where would we go? What would we do?" Dan's eyes lit up with possibility. "I know a place. A valley about 50 miles north of here, near the old Apache lands. There's good water, fertile soil, and it's far enough from any towns that we could live in peace. We could build something together, a ranch, maybe a trading post. My grandfather always said the Apache and Mexican traders would welcome an honest dealer who spoke their languages." Catherine felt a flutter of excitement despite her fears. "You really think we could make a life there?" "I think we could make a better life there than we're making here," Dan said. "But there's something else we need to discuss first." Catherine raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Marriage," Dan said simply. "I want you to be my wife, Catherine. Not just because of what people are saying, but because I can't imagine my life without you." Catherine's heart raced. She had dreamed of this moment, but she had also dreaded it. Marriage to Dan would make their relationship permanent and public in a way that would close the door on any chance of reconciling with the town. "The preacher here won't marry us," she said practically. "He's made that very clear," Dan smiled. "I wasn't thinking of asking him. My grandfather's brother, Joseph Running Bear, is still alive. He's a medicine man among the Apache, and he can perform a marriage ceremony according to tribal custom. It wouldn't be recognized by the territorial government, but it would be real to us and to the Apache people." Catherine thought about this. A traditional Apache wedding ceremony would be completely foreign to everything she had known growing up. But then again, so was everything else about her life now. And if it meant she could truly be Dan's wife, she was willing to embrace his traditions. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dan's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen from him. He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. We'll be exiles from this world, but we'll have each other." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Catherine replied. They planned the ceremony for early March, when the weather would be mild enough for travel. Joseph Running Bear lived in a hidden canyon 2 days' ride from Cedar Ridge, in territory that was technically part of the Apache reservation, but was so remote that government officials rarely ventured there. Catherine wrote a letter to her family back in Boston, telling them about her decision to marry Dan. She didn't expect them to understand or approve, but she felt they deserved to know. The response came back faster than she had anticipated. A brief, cold note from her father stating that if she went through with this unholy alliance, she would no longer be considered part of the family. Her mother and sisters were forbidden from corresponding with her. The letter hurt more than Catherine had expected, but it also strengthened her resolve. If her own family could abandon her so easily, they had never truly loved her at all. Dan's love was real and constant, and that was worth more than the approval of people who valued social convention over human dignity. Word of their wedding plans somehow leaked out to the townspeople, and the reaction was explosive. A group of men, led by Mayor Bradley, came to the schoolhouse one evening to make a final attempt to talk sense into Catherine. "Miss Wells," Bradley said, his voice stern, "this has gone far enough. If you go through with this marriage, you'll be finished as a teacher not just here, but anywhere in the territory. No decent community will hire a woman who has married an Indian." "Then I suppose I'll have to find an indecent community," Catherine replied coolly. "Or better yet, I'll create my own." The men exchanged glances. One of them, a rancher named Peterson, stepped forward. "And what about him? What about your precious half-breed? You think he'll be safe after this?" "There are ways of dealing with troublemakers who don't know their place." Catherine felt ice in her veins. "Are you threatening my fiancé, Mr. Peterson?" "I'm just saying that some folks might take it upon themselves to solve this problem permanently," Peterson replied with a nasty smile. That night, Catherine told Dan about the threats. His face darkened with anger, but his voice remained calm. "We need to move up our timeline," he said. "I'll ride out tomorrow to speak with Joseph Running Bear. If he agrees, we'll have the ceremony as soon as possible, then head straight to the valley." 3 days later, on a crisp March morning, Catherine packed her few belongings into Dan's wagon. She took only what she could carry: her clothes, her precious books, and the small amount of money she had saved. Everything else, the furniture provided with the schoolhouse, the teaching supplies she had bought with her own money, the life she had tried to build in Cedar Ridge, she left behind. The ceremony took place in a hidden meadow surrounded by red canyon walls. Joseph Running Bear was an ancient man with wise eyes and hands weathered by decades of life in the desert. He spoke very little English, so Dan translated the Apache words that bound them together as husband and wife. Catherine had never imagined her wedding would be like this. No white dress, no church, no family or friends to witness the event. Instead, she wore a simple dress and a necklace of turquoise beads that Joseph Running Bear blessed for her. Dan wore traditional Apache clothing that had belonged to his grandfather. The only witnesses were Joseph and his wife, an elderly Apache woman who smiled at Catherine with genuine warmth. But as they spoke their vows in both English and Apache, promising to love and support each other through whatever hardships lay ahead, Catherine felt more married than any fancy church ceremony could have made her feel. This was real, and it was theirs. After the ceremony, they rode north toward their new life. As they left the familiar landscape of Cedar Ridge behind, Catherine felt a mixture of fear and excitement. They were truly on their own now, with nothing but each other and Dan's knowledge of the land to sustain them. "Are you having second thoughts?" Dan asked as they made camp their first night on the trail. Catherine looked at him across their small campfire, this man who had given up everything he knew to start fresh with her, just as she had given up everything for him. "No," she said firmly. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." But even as she spoke those words, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that their real challenges were just beginning. The desert ahead was vast and unforgiving, and they would have to prove themselves worthy of the life they wanted to build together. The valley that Dan had chosen for their new home was unlike anything Catherine had ever seen. Hidden between towering red cliffs and accessible only through a narrow canyon passage, it felt like a secret world. A clear stream ran through the center, fed by springs that never went dry even in the harshest summers. Cottonwood trees lined the water's edge, their leaves whispering in the desert wind. The Apache called this place Where Water Sings, and Catherine understood why the moment she heard the musical sound of the stream flowing over smooth stones. "It's beautiful," she whispered, as their wagon emerged from the canyon into the hidden valley. "But it feels so isolated. Are you sure we can make a life here?" Dan smiled, his eyes scanning the landscape with the practiced gaze of someone who knew how to read the land's possibilities. "This isolation is exactly what we need right now. And look closer. This valley has everything we need to thrive." Over the following days, Dan showed Catherine what he meant. The soil near the stream was rich and dark, perfect for growing crops. Natural caves in the cliff walls could be used for storage, keeping food cool in summer and preventing it from freezing in winter. Game trails crisscrossed the valley, indicating that deer and other animals regularly came here to drink. Most importantly, the single entrance made it easy to defend if necessary. They spent their first month building a simple but sturdy cabin near the stream. Dan's knowledge of traditional Apache building techniques, combined with skills he had learned from Mexican carpenters, allowed them to create a home that was both practical and comfortable. Catherine threw herself into the work with determination that surprised even her. Her hands, which had once been soft from a life of teaching and paperwork, grew calloused from handling logs and stones. "I never knew I could do this kind of work," Catherine said one evening as they sat outside their finished cabin, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and red. "You're stronger than you think," Dan replied. "I saw it that first day when you didn't hesitate to trust me with your students' lives. Physical strength is just another skill to learn." As spring turned to summer, they began to understand the rhythm of their new life. Dan taught Catherine to identify edible plants, to read weather signs in cloud formations, and to track animals by their footprints. Catherine organized their supplies with the efficiency of a trained teacher, creating systems for everything from food storage to tool maintenance. Together, they planted a garden that flourished in the fertile soil. But Dan had bigger plans than just surviving in isolation. He had noticed signs that this valley was part of an important trade route used by Apache bands, traveling between reservations, and by Mexican traders moving goods north from Sonora. If they could establish themselves as trustworthy intermediaries, they might build something much more significant than a simple homestead. The Apache and Mexican traders need someone they can trust, Dan explained to Catherine as they worked in their garden one morning. Someone who speaks their languages, understands their customs, and deals fairly. Most white traders try to cheat them, and government officials don't understand their needs. Catherine looked up from the beans she was planting. You're talking about becoming merchants ourselves. Exactly. We could start small, trading surplus from our garden for manufactured goods, then gradually expand. The Apache need things like metal tools, cloth, and coffee. The Mexicans want furs and hides. We could be the bridge between them. The idea excited Catherine more than she had expected. It would use both Dan's cultural knowledge and her business skills from managing the school's budget and correspondence. We'd need to build trust first. People would have to know they could rely on us. Their first opportunity came in late summer when a small band of Apache, led by an old man named Gray Wolf, appeared at the entrance to their valley. Dan went out to meet them, speaking in the flowing Apache language that Catherine was slowly beginning to recognize. After a long conversation, he invited them to share a meal at the cabin. Catherine was nervous about meeting her first Apache visitors, but Gray Wolf and his companions treated her with quiet respect. Through Dan's translation, she learned that Gray Wolf had known Dan's grandfather and remembered Dan as a child. He was curious about this white woman who had chosen to live in the traditional Apache lands. He wants to know if you are truly married to me, or if you are my captive, Dan translated with a slight smile. Catherine looked directly at Gray Wolf and spoke slowly, knowing that Dan would translate. Tell him that I chose this life freely because I love my husband and I respect his people. Tell him that I hope to learn the wisdom of the Apache, and to be worthy of living in this sacred place. Gray Wolf listened to the translation, then studied Catherine for a long moment. Finally, he smiled and spoke a few words that made Dan's face light up. What did he say? Catherine asked. He said you have clear eyes and a strong spirit. He gives us his blessing to live in this valley. That evening, Gray Wolf's band shared stories and songs around their campfire. Catherine couldn't understand most of the words, but she felt the warmth of acceptance in their gestures and smiles. When they left the next morning, Gray Wolf pressed a small carved stone into Catherine's hand, a symbol of protection that had been blessed by Apache medicine. Men word of the respectful white woman and her Apache husband began to spread through the network of traders and tribal groups that use the old routes. A month later, a Mexican trading party led by a man named Roberto Valdez appeared in their valley. Dan and Roberto conversed easily in Spanish, and Catherine impressed the Mexicans by showing them through their well-organized cabin and demonstrating the quality of the vegetables from their garden. Your wife is a woman of substance, Roberto told Dan in Spanish, not knowing that Catherine had been learning the language and could understand him. She has the eyes of someone who pays attention to details. This is good for business. Catherine smiled but said nothing, filing away this information for later. If these traders thought she was just a pretty decoration for Dan's business dealings, they were in for a surprise. By autumn, they had conducted their first real trades. Catherine's carefully preserved vegetables and medicinal herbs, combined with Dan's knowledge of where to find the best hunting and gathering spots, gave them valuable goods to offer. In return, they acquired metal tools, cloth, coffee, and other manufactured items that were highly prized by the Apache and Mexican communities. Catherine proved to have a natural talent for negotiation. Her teaching experience had taught her to read people's expressions and motivations, skills that translated perfectly to trading. She could tell when someone was trying to deceive them, when they were desperate and needed help, or when they were testing to see if these newcomers could be trusted. You drive a hard bargain, Señora, Roberto said to Catherine in Spanish during one particularly complex trade negotiation. He had finally realized that she understood every word he was saying. Catherine smiled sweetly and replied in his own language, I learned from the best teachers, children who tried to convince me their dogs ate their homework. Roberto burst into laughter. I think we are going to do much business together, you and I. As winter approached, Dan and Catherine had established themselves as reliable and honest traders. Their cabin had grown into a small compound with storage buildings, guest quarters for visiting traders, and a workshop where Dan repaired tools and weapons. Catherine had created detailed records of every transaction, building relationships with customers who knew they could trust her to keep track of complex trades and payment arrangements. But their success was about more than just business. They had created something that was desperately needed in this time and place, a neutral ground where different cultures could meet and trade safely. Apache families knew they could find fair prices and honest dealing at the valley. Mexican traders knew they wouldn't be cheated or turned away because of their nationality. And gradually, word began to spread even to the white settlements that there was a place where you could get things done without the usual conflicts and misunderstandings. "We're building something important here," Catherine said to Dan one evening as they reviewed their trading records by lamplight. "It's not just about making money. We're helping people who have been enemies learn to work together." Dan nodded, his arm around her shoulders as they sat at their table. "My grandfather always said that the best way to honor your ancestors is to build something that makes the world a little better than you found it." Looking around their warm cabin, with its shelves full of goods from dozens of different suppliers, and its walls decorated with gifts from grateful trading partners, Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had taken their exile from Cedar Ridge and transformed it into an opportunity to create something entirely new, a life that honored both of their backgrounds while building bridges between different worlds. But even as they celebrated their growing success, both Dan and Catherine knew that their peaceful valley couldn't remain hidden forever. The world outside was changing rapidly, and eventually those changes would reach even their remote sanctuary. When that time came, they would need to be ready to defend not just their business but their right to exist as they had chosen to live. By 1885, the Apache Wars that had raged across the Southwest for decades were reaching a critical point. The famous Apache leader Geronimo was still fighting a desperate campaign against the U.S. Army, but many other Apache bands were ready to consider peace. The problem was that neither side trusted the other enough to sit down and have honest conversations about ending the conflict, and in Catherine's trading post had become known throughout the region as a place where different groups could meet safely. Their reputation for fairness and honesty had spread far beyond their hidden valley. When General George Crook, who was leading the Army's efforts to end the Apache Wars, heard about this unusual couple who seemed to have the respect of both Apache leaders and Mexican traders, he decided to investigate personally. Catherine was working in their expanded garden when she saw a dust cloud approaching the valley entrance. This was unusual. Most of their visitors came in small groups, and they always sent a scout ahead to announce their arrival. This looked like a much larger party, and they were moving with military precision. "Dan," she called to her husband, who was repairing harnesses in the workshop they had built behind their cabin. "We have visitors, a lot of them." Dan emerged from the workshop, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that he always kept nearby. Living peacefully didn't mean living carelessly. They had made enemies among some of the white settlers who resented their success, and there were always bandits and renegades who might see their trading post as an easy target. But as the riders came into view, Dan relaxed slightly. The man in the lead was clearly a military officer, riding with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him came a small squad of cavalry soldiers, but their weapons were holstered and their posture suggested they were here to talk, not fight. "General Crook," Dan said quietly as the riders approached. "I've heard of him. He's supposed to be one of the few Army officers who actually tries to understand the Apache." Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and stood beside her husband as the military party rode up to their cabin. General Crook was a tall, weathered man with intelligent eyes and a beard that had been grayed by years of frontier service. He dismounted and approached them with the kind of careful respect that suggested he knew exactly who they were and why their opinion mattered. "Mr. Crowfeather." "Mrs. Crowfeather," he said, nodding to each of them in turn. "I'm General George Crook. I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit, but I have a proposition that I believe might interest you both." "General," Dan replied formally. "You're welcome here. Would you like to water your horses and share a meal while we talk?" Crook smiled. "I'd appreciate that very much. It's been a long ride from Fort Apache." As they prepared food for their unexpected guests, Catherine found herself studying General Crook. She had expected a typical military officer, rigid, dismissive of anyone who wasn't white and male, focused only on winning battles. Instead, she saw a man who seemed genuinely interested in finding solutions rather than just imposing his will by force. "Mrs. Crowfeather," Crook said as they sat down to eat. "I understand you were a teacher before coming here." "I was," Catherine replied carefully, "in Boston and briefly in Cedar Ridge. And now you're running a successful trading operation that serves multiple communities. That takes considerable skill and intelligence." Catherine exchanged a glance with Dan. This wasn't what she had expected from their first conversation with a U.S. Army general. "Thank you, General. We've been fortunate to build good relationships with our trading partners." Crook leaned forward slightly. "That's exactly why I'm here. The Apache Wars have been going on for too long. Too many people have died on both sides. I believe there's a way to end the fighting, but it requires people who can speak to both sides and be trusted by both sides." Dan set down his coffee cup. "What are you asking of us, General?" "I'm asking you to help me arrange peace talks. There are Apache leaders who are tired of running and fighting, but they don't trust government officials. They need to hear from someone they respect that they can negotiate in good faith without being betrayed." Catherine felt her heart race. This was far beyond anything she had imagined when they first came to the valley. "General, we're just traders. We're not diplomats." "Sometimes the best diplomats are people who aren't officially diplomats," Crook replied. "You've already proven that Apache, Mexican, and American traders can work together peacefully. Now I'm asking you to help extend that peace to a much larger scale." Dan was quiet for a long moment, considering the general's words. Catherine could see the conflict in his face. His Apache heritage made him sympathetic to his people's desire for freedom and self-determination. But he also understood that the old ways of life were ending, and that continued fighting would only lead to more death and suffering. "What guarantees can you offer?" Dan asked finally. "The Apache have been betrayed by government promises before." Crook nodded grimly. "I can't guarantee everything will go perfectly. But I can guarantee that I'll personally ensure any agreements are honored. And I can guarantee that if we don't try to make peace soon, this war will end with the complete destruction of the Apache people." The general's words hung heavy in the air. Everyone at the table knew he was right. The Apache were running out of places to hide, running out of young men to fight, running out of hope. Continued resistance might preserve their pride, but it wouldn't preserve their lives. "We'll need time to think about this," Catherine said. "Of course," Crook replied, "but not too much time. Events are moving quickly, and opportunities for peace don't last forever." After the general and his men left the next morning, Dan and Catherine spent long hours discussing the decision before them. If they agreed to help with peace negotiations, they would be taking enormous risks. Some Apache might see them as traitors to their people. Some whites might see them as Indian sympathizers. And if the peace talks failed, they could become targets for revenge from all sides, but they also understood that this might be their chance to use the trust they had, built to save lives and create a better future for everyone in the region. 2 weeks later, they sent word to General Crook that they would help arrange a meeting between Apache leaders and government officials. The location would be their valley, neutral ground where both sides could feel safe. The peace talks that followed were unlike anything that had been attempted before. Instead of the formal, intimidating atmosphere of military meetings, Catherine and Dan created an environment that encouraged honest conversation. They provided food prepared in both Apache and Mexican traditions. They arranged for Apache elders to share traditional stories, helping the government officials understand the cultural and spiritual reasons behind Apache resistance. Catherine found herself serving as more than just a translator. Her teaching experience helped her explain complex concepts in ways that both sides could understand. When negotiations got heated, her calm presence often helped defuse tensions. The Apache respected her because she was married to one of their own and had chosen to live according to traditional ways. The government officials respected her because she was educated and could speak their language. "You have a gift for this," General Crook told her during a break in one particularly difficult session. "Have you ever considered that you might be helping to write history?" Catherine looked out over the valley where Apache leaders sat in small groups with Army officers and territorial officials, sharing meals and actually listening to each other for perhaps the first time in decades. "I just want the fighting to stop," she said. There's been enough suffering on all sides. The peace talks didn't solve everything overnight. Some Apache bands, led by leaders like Geronimo, chose to continue fighting rather than accept reservation life. But several major chiefs agreed to negotiate endings to their campaigns, saving countless lives on both sides. More importantly, the success of the Valley peace talks established Dan and Catherine as trusted intermediaries who could bring different groups together when conflicts arose. Over the following months, they found themselves mediating disputes between ranchers and Mexican farmers, between mining companies and Apache bands whose traditional lands were being invaded, between different Apache groups who had disagreements about how to adapt to changing times. "We're becoming something I never expected," Catherine said to Dan one evening, as they reviewed correspondence from various officials asking for their help with new problems. "We're becoming peacemakers." Dan smiled, his arm around her as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin. "My grandfather always said that the greatest warriors are those who find ways to win without fighting. Maybe this is our way of being warriors." As word of their success spread, their trading post evolved into something unique in the Southwest, a place where conflicts could be resolved peacefully, where different cultures could meet and learn from each other, and where the skills of two people who had been rejected by mainstream society proved invaluable in creating a better future for everyone. But even as they celebrated their growing influence as peacemakers, Dan and Catherine knew that their most important battles still lay ahead. The frontier was changing rapidly. By 1890, the couple that had once been mocked and driven from Cedar Ridge had become the most respected mediators in the Arizona Territory. Their reputation had spread far beyond the Southwest, reaching newspaper offices in San Francisco, Denver, and even New York. Magazine writers made the journey to their remote valley to interview the remarkable pair who had built bridges between cultures that had been at war for generations. Catherine was no longer the frightened schoolteacher who had fled Boston in disgrace. At 35, she had become a confident woman whose opinion was sought by territorial governors, military commanders, and business leaders. Her medical practice, which had begun with simple remedies learned from Apache women, now served people from dozens of communities across the territory. She had successfully treated everything from broken bones to epidemic diseases, combining traditional Apache healing methods with the latest medical knowledge she obtained through correspondence with doctors in eastern cities. "Mrs. Crowfeather," said Dr. William Harrison, who had traveled from Phoenix to observe her methods, "your success rate with patients is remarkable. Have you ever considered writing about your techniques?" Catherine looked up from the medicinal herbs she was preparing for a trader who suffered from chronic pain. "I've been keeping detailed records," she said. "Not for publication, but because I want to make sure I can teach others what I've learned." Dr. Harrison nodded enthusiastically. The combination of traditional Apache knowledge with modern medical principles could revolutionize frontier healthcare. You could save thousands of lives if this information were more widely available. It was an idea that appealed to Catherine. She had already begun training several Apache women and the wives of Mexican traders in basic medical techniques. Teaching had always been her passion, and medicine had become a natural extension of that calling. Dan's influence had grown equally impressive. His wooden leg, which had once been a source of mockery, was now barely noticed by the diverse stream of visitors who came to seek his counsel. His reputation for fairness and wisdom had made him the unofficial judge for disputes that couldn't be resolved through normal legal channels. When conflicts arose between different communities, people on all sides trusted him to find solutions that protected everyone's interests. "Mr. Crowfeather," said James McKinley, a representative of the territorial legislature, "we're preparing for Arizona's statehood. The federal government wants to know that we can maintain peace and order. Your work has been essential to proving that different communities can coexist successfully." Dan and McKinley were sitting on the porch of the main house, which had grown from a simple cabin into a substantial building that could house visiting delegations. The compound now included guest quarters, a medical clinic, warehouses for trading goods, and workshops where Apache craftsmen taught traditional skills to anyone willing to learn. "Statehood will bring changes," Dan replied thoughtfully. "New laws, new ways of doing business, new people moving in. We need to make sure those changes don't destroy the cooperation we've built." McKinley leaned forward eagerly. "That's exactly why we need your help. Governor Murphy wants to appoint you to the commission that will oversee the transition to statehood. Your voice could ensure that Apache and Mexican communities have representation in the new government. It was a remarkable offer. Just 8 years earlier, Dan had been an outcast that most people were afraid to acknowledge. Now he was being asked to help shape the future of an entire state. But the recognition hadn't come without costs. Their success had made them targets for people who resented their influence. Some white settlers still saw them as troublemakers who gave too much power to inferior groups. Some Apache traditionalists believed they had betrayed their heritage by working too closely with the government. There had been threats, and more than one attempt to undermine their work through sabotage and false accusations. "We're walking a tightrope," Catherine said to Dan one evening, as they reviewed letters from various officials requesting their involvement in territorial affairs. "We have influence now, but we also have enemies who would love to see us fail." Dan nodded grimly. "But we also have something we didn't have before. Allies who understand what we're trying to accomplish. People who know that what we've built here is worth protecting." Those allies included some surprising names. General Crook, now promoted and stationed in Washington, had written several reports praising their work. Wealthy businessmen who had profited from the stability their mediation provided had become financial supporters. Even some of the newspaper writers who had initially come to write sensational stories about the strange couple in the desert had become genuine advocates for their methods. The most significant recognition came when President Benjamin Harrison himself sent a personal representative to observe their operation. Colonel William Andrews arrived with instructions to evaluate whether the crow-feather model could be replicated in other frontier regions where conflicts persisted. Resident Harrison is particularly interested in your educational efforts, Colonel Andrews told Catherine as she showed him through the school she had established in their valley. Teaching both Apache and English languages, combining traditional and modern knowledge, it's exactly the kind of innovation we need. The school had been Catherine's proudest achievement. It served children from Apache families, Mexican trading families, and even some white settlers who were willing to send their children to learn from teachers who might have dark skin or speak with accents. The students learned reading, writing, and arithmetic in both English and their native languages. They also learned practical skills like farming, animal husbandry, and basic medical care. "Education is the key to everything," Catherine explained to the colonel as they watched Apache children working alongside Mexican and white children on a mathematics lesson. When children learn together, they grow up understanding that people who look different or speak different languages can still be friends and partners. Colonel Andrews was clearly impressed. "How do you handle resistance from parents who don't want their children mixing with other groups?" Catherine smiled. "We let the results speak for themselves. The children who attend our school consistently outperform those who don't, regardless of their background. Parents want their children to succeed, and they can see that cooperation produces better outcomes than isolation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. In late 1891, a delegation arrived from Cedar Ridge, the same town that had driven Catherine and Dan away nearly a decade earlier. The group included Mayor Bradley, now an older and humbler man, and several other townspeople who had once been their harshest critics. "Mrs. Crowfeather," Bradley said, his hat in his hands as he stood in the courtyard of their compound, "we've come to ask for your help." Catherine studied the faces of these people who had once treated her with such cruelty. Time had not been kind to Cedar Ridge. The town had struggled economically, losing population as mining operations moved elsewhere. Conflicts with neighboring communities had escalated, and there had been several violent incidents that had driven away potential settlers and businesses. "What kind of help?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice neutral. "We have problems with the Apache band that moved onto the reservation near our town," Bradley said. "There have been misunderstandings, conflicts over water rights, accusations of cattle theft. People are talking about taking matters into their own hands, but we remember what happened when violence was the answer to everything." Dan stepped forward. "You want us to mediate between your town and the Apache?" "We know we have no right to ask," Bradley continued. "We know how we treated you both. But you're the only people in the territory who might be able to prevent bloodshed." Catherine exchanged a long look with Dan. They could easily have refused, could have pointed out the irony of these people coming for help to the couple they had once scorned. But that wasn't who they had become. "We'll come," Catherine said finally, "not because you deserve our help, but because the Apache families and the innocent people in your town don't deserve to suffer for past mistakes." The mediation in Cedar Ridge was one of their most challenging assignments. Old prejudices ran deep on both sides, and there were people who actively wanted the talks to fail so they could justify taking violent action. But Catherine and Dan had learned how to work with even the most difficult personalities. They spent weeks in the town, meeting with families, listening to grievances, and gradually building understanding between groups that had been taught to hate each other. "You know," Bradley said to Catherine near the end of their stay, "I owe you an apology." "A dozen apologies. We were wrong about you and your husband. We were wrong about everything." Catherine looked at this man who had once threatened her job and her future. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Bradley. The question is whether we learn from them." When they returned to their valley, Catherine and Dan found a stack of letters waiting for them. Requests for mediation from communities across the Southwest. Invitations to speak at universities in California and Colorado. An offer from a publishing company to write a book about their methods. As the new century dawned in 1900, Catherine and Dan Crowfeather had become living legends across the American Southwest. Their story was told in school books, their methods were studied by government officials, and their valley had become a destination for people from around the world who wanted to see how different cultures could live and work together in harmony. The seashore trading post had evolved into something that no one could have imagined when they first arrived as exiles. It was now a small town in its own right, with permanent residents from Apache, Mexican, Anglo, and other backgrounds. The school Catherine had founded now had 4 teachers and served over 60 children. The medical clinic treated patients from hundreds of miles away. The workshops produced goods that were sold as far away as New York and San Francisco. But more than the physical success, Catherine and Dan had created something that touched people's hearts and minds. They had proven that love could overcome prejudice, that cooperation could triumph over conflict, and that people who seemed to have nothing in common could build something beautiful together. In 1902, when Catherine was 47 and Dan was 51, they received an invitation that surprised them both. The newly established University of Arizona wanted Dan to give a series of lectures on conflict resolution and Catherine to teach courses on frontier medicine and multicultural education. Professor Crowfeather. Catherine teased her husband as they read the letter. "It has a nice ring to it." Dan laughed, but Catherine could see he was genuinely moved by the recognition. 20 years ago, most universities wouldn't have let me through their front doors. Now they want me to teach their students. The lectures were tremendously successful. Students packed the halls to hear Dan speak about turning enemies into allies, about finding common ground between different cultures, about the power of patient understanding to solve seemingly impossible problems. Catherine's medical demonstrations showing how traditional Apache remedies could be combined with modern techniques attracted doctors and nurses from across the territory. "You're not just teachers," said Dr. Robert Mitchell, the university president, after attending one of Catherine's lectures. "You're pioneers of ideas that could change how we think about human relationships." But even as they received accolades from the academic world, Catherine and Dan remained committed to the practical work of helping real people solve real problems. Their valley continued to serve as a neutral meeting ground where conflicts could be resolved peacefully. They mediated everything from family disputes to international trade disagreements between Mexican and American merchants. One of their most challenging cases came in 1905, when a conflict erupted between Apache families who wanted to maintain traditional ways of life and younger Apache who wanted to adopt more modern practices. The dispute had split several bands and threatened to become violent. "This is harder than mediating between different peoples," Dan told Catherine as they prepared for the talks. "When families are divided against themselves, the pain goes much deeper." Catherine nodded. She had seen similar conflicts in her own community, between Apache women who wanted to preserve traditional healing practices and those who wanted to learn modern medicine. But it's also an opportunity to show that change doesn't have to mean losing everything that matters. The Apache reconciliation talks lasted 3 months. Catherine and Dan had to use every skill they had learned over the years: patience, empathy, cultural sensitivity, and an absolute commitment to finding solutions that honored everyone's concerns. The breakthrough came when they helped both sides see that tradition and progress didn't have to be enemies. The old ways teach us how to be strong, explained elderly Apache leader Standing Bear. The new ways teach us how to survive in a changing world. Perhaps we need both. The success of the Apache reconciliation brought Catherine and Dan to the attention of people far beyond the Southwest. In 1908, they received an unexpected visitor, President Theodore Roosevelt himself, who had come to see firsthand the methods that were being called the Arizona Miracle. Mr. and Mrs. Crowfeather, President Roosevelt said as they gave him a tour of their valley. What you've accomplished here represents the best of American ideals. You've shown that our country's strength comes not from forcing everyone to be the same, but from helping different people work together. The president's visit resulted in federal funding for programs based on the Crowfeather model. Schools across the West began incorporating multicultural education. Medical schools started teaching courses that combined traditional and modern healing methods. Government agencies began using Catherine and Dan's mediation techniques to resolve conflicts with Native American tribes. But success brought new responsibilities and new challenges. As their influence grew, so did the demands on their time and energy. Catherine, now in her 50s, found herself traveling constantly to speak at conferences and advise government officials. Dan served on multiple commissions and advisory boards. Sometimes they worried that they were becoming so busy promoting their ideas that they were losing touch with the practical work that had inspired those ideas in the first place. "I miss the simple days," Catherine said to Dan one evening as they sat in their valley, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in familiar shades of gold and red. "When it was just us and the people who came here needing help." Dan took her hand. "We can't go back to those days, but we can make sure we don't lose what made them special. Our work has always been about helping individuals, one person at a time. That hasn't changed." As they entered their 60s, Catherine and Dan began to think more seriously about ensuring their legacy would continue after they were gone. They established a foundation that would maintain their programs and continue their work. They trained younger mediators and teachers who could carry on their methods. Most importantly, they documented everything they had learned in detailed writings that future generations could study and adapt. In 1910, when Arizona finally achieved statehood, Dan was invited to speak at the celebration ceremony in Phoenix. Standing before a crowd of thousands, the man who had once been mocked as a crippled Apache delivered words that would be remembered long after he was gone. "Arizona is becoming a state today," he said, "but it became a true community years ago, when people of different backgrounds decided to work together instead of against each other. Our state's greatest strength is not our resources or our land, but our people, all of our people, working together to build something better than any of us could create alone." Catherine watched from the audience, her heart full of pride for the man she had loved for nearly 30 years. They had come so far from the frightened teacher and the isolated rancher who had first met during a flood in Cedar Ridge. They had built not just a life together, but a legacy that would outlive them both. Dan's health began to decline in 1911. The old injury to his leg, combined with decades of hard physical work, finally caught up with him. Catherine cared for him with the same dedication she had shown to countless other patients, but she knew that their time together was limited. "I'm not afraid of dying," Dan told her one quiet morning as they sat together in their garden. "We've had a good life, a meaningful life. We've left the world a little better than we found it." Dan Crowfeather died peacefully in 1912, surrounded by Catherine and the many people whose lives he had touched. His funeral was unlike anything the Southwest had ever seen. Apache leaders came from distant reservations. Mexican dignitaries traveled from Sonora. Government officials arrived from Washington. Former enemies sat side by side to honor a man who had taught them all that cooperation was stronger than conflict. Catherine continued their work for 11 more years, never remarrying, but never alone. The valley they had built together continued to serve as a beacon of hope and reconciliation. The school expanded, the medical clinic saved thousands of lives, and the mediation programs prevented countless conflicts from turning violent. When Catherine died in 1923 at the age of 68, she was buried beside Dan in the cemetery they had established in their valley. Their graves became a pilgrimage site for people who wanted to pay their respects to the couple who had proven that love could overcome any obstacle. Today, The valley where Catherine and Dan built their life together is a historical site. Visitors can tour the buildings they constructed, read their writings, and learn about the principles they lived by. Their methods are still taught in universities. Their story is still told to children learning about American history, but perhaps the most fitting tribute to their legacy is not found in museums or textbooks. It's found in the countless communities across America where people of different backgrounds work together, where conflicts are resolved through understanding rather than violence, where love is stronger than prejudice. The foundation Catherine and Dan established continues to operate today, training mediators and teachers in their methods. The school they founded has graduated thousands of students who carry their values into the modern world. The medical techniques Catherine developed are still used by healthcare providers who serve diverse communities. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, where their story began with rejection and hatred,